Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hello, welcome. My name is Annie Rogers, and on behalf of the Attitude team, I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's ADHD Experts presentation titled Motivating Your Child with ADHD, What Ignites Interest and Energy for Learning? And leading today's webinar will be Jerome Schultz, PhD. He is a clinical neuropsychologist on the faculty of Harvard Medical School in the Department of Psychiatry. He began his career as a special education teacher in middle schools in Ohio and Massachusetts. And for more than 4 decades, he has specialized in the neuropsychological assessment and treatment of children and young adults with ADHD and LD. He serves as a consultant to schools across the United States and abroad, focusing on issues related to neuropsychology and education of children and young adults with special needs. And he's written dozens of articles, presented many webinars about kids with ADHD and related conditions. His book, which is titled Nowhere to Hide, Why Kids with ADHD and LD Hate School and What We Can Do About It, examines the role of stress in learning and has served as a practical guide for families and schools. For obvious reasons, we are so fortunate to have Jerome with us today, and he's going to take us through explaining using neuroscience and behavioral science to help us really understand why motivation wanes, dips, falls in teens and children with ADHD, and how we can implement some easy and practical strategies to improve motivation in our kids and teens. Before I hand over the microphone to Jerome, I have just a few very quick housekeeping items. Those of you who are tuned into the live webinar, you can download the slides right now by clicking on the event resources section of your webinar screen. And if you're interested in the certificate of attendance option, just look for instructions that will come in an email about an hour after we wrap up the live broadcast. If you're listening in replay or podcast mode, you can visit attitudemag.com. Just search podcast 364 to access the slides, the webinar replay, and the certificate of attendance option. Finally, if you support the work we're doing here at Attitude to strengthen the ADHD community, we encourage you to visit attitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for Attitude Magazine for your family or to share with a teacher or loved one who could benefit from greater ADHD understanding. So without further ado, I am so pleased to hand over the microphone to Jerome Schultz, PhD, on this incredibly important topic of motivating your child with ADHD. Thank you for joining us today.
It is absolutely my pleasure to be on with you. I'm always so happy to have the opportunity to share a little bit about what I know a lot about and have the chance to perhaps give the people in the listening audience some strategies and techniques and a better degree of understanding about what's going on with kids who don't seem to be able to get it in gear or keep it in gear. So I'm really happy to have this opportunity. Let's jump right into this because we have a significant amount of material to cover, and I have some stories and anecdotes to tell you to help drive those points home. But I just want to start off by saying I started my career off as a classroom teacher, and I was working with a lot of kids, many of whom had ADD or learning disabilities or ADHD or other conditions. And one of the biggest struggles for me as a teacher was getting kids motivated, getting kids interested in what it was that I was required to teach them or wanted to teach them. And that was always a big struggle. And as a parent, I've encountered difficulties too in trying to get my own kids or now grandkids engaged in learning. And I've tried to learn from the experiences of people who have both had difficulty turning on and tuning into learning, and also those who have been successful, because I think if you look at both sides of the equation, it helps you develop a better understanding. What I'd like to cover in this webinar is on your screen now, what it means to be motivated, why we do things in the first place, and more importantly, I think why we don't do things. And all of us have these things in our lives, things that we love to do, we do over and over again, and there are things that we wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. So I want to look at the dynamics behind that. I also want to look specifically at why a lot of kids and young adults with ADHD experience problems with motivation. It's a special kind of thing when we're talking about kids or young adults with a neurologically based condition like ADHD. I want to help explore this curious phenomenon about why some kids seem obsessed with certain activities. They get addicted to things. And we use that term often when we talk about video games or other kinds of activities that are electronically based. But I'd like to have us come away from this with a better understanding of why kids seem obsessed with certain activities. And more important to all of us is how to get them more interested, motivated, or even excited about things like schoolwork. I also want to explore why some kids don't seem to be motivated to do almost anything. Kids who are like bumps on a log. And I've seen kids in my professional career as a neuropsychologist and as a teacher who have displayed what I would consider to be intense resistance. It seems like everything we throw at them, their answer is no. And I'd like to help you kind of unlock that, because it's not that I have all the answers to this, but I think because I have an understanding of kids from a very practical point of view, but also from a neuropsychological point of view, I've got some insights that might be helpful to you. So I'd like to help us all figure out how to get kids to jump in, do the work, and not try to escape. And the word escape in that sentence is a really important one, because as we talk about in the next 25 or 35 minutes, a lot of kids are not motivated because they're trying to escape from something or avoid something. But that's only a piece of the picture. So let's move ahead and dig into this a bit. What's my approach? I think you can probably surmise from the things that I said at the opening of this webinar, is that I like to combine my knowledge of behavioral science, both in a practical way and in a scientific way, why people do what they do, and pair this with neuroscience. Nothing happens in isolation. There's always something going on in our brains that either helps us focus, pay attention, sustain attention, be motivated. And I think it's important to understand that although a lot of this seems attitudinal, my kid has a negative attitude about this, a bad attitude, my kid never wants to do anything. Those are the behaviors that we see, and we can take our clues from those behaviors to start to understand why any person would be that way. And the other thing that typifies my approach is that I'm a pragmatist. I don't like to give suggestions that are just theoretical or hypothetical. I like to offer suggestions or strategies that have worked for me as a clinician, as a parent, as a teacher, and have worked for a lot of the people that I've worked with, both teachers across the globe and parents across the United States. So let's keep moving ahead. It's probably helpful to start out with a definition of motivation. And there are two definitions that prevail in the literature. One is the motivation is a general desire or unwillingness of someone to do something. Pretty simple statement, but it's a state of being. The reason or reasons a person has for acting or behaving in a particular way. That's also another way to look at motivation. And I think that's true of most of the people in the world. But if we're thinking about specifically a presentation focusing on the needs of kids with identified or unidentified learning and attention problems, it changes a little bit, because ADHD, learning disabilities, Asperger's syndrome, all kinds of conditions that can get layered on kids who are neurotypical or neuroatypical or not like most other kids. Those layers create difficulty or filters that makes this population of kids a little more special, a little more unique, and makes them a bit of a challenge to understand. But let's give it a try. So the big question I'm here to answer, and I hope you're here to learn about, is why do kids with ADHD find it difficult to initiate tasks, that is, start doing something? Why do they find it difficult to keep doing what they're doing? And why do they find it difficult to finish tasks? And why do they do some things and not others? Why are they passionate about some things? And it tends not to be schoolwork. Let's try to figure that out. So here's something that I pulled out of my training in history, and that's the work of a psychologist named Abraham Maslow. I don't want to spend a lot of time with this, but if you look at this, this is supposed to be, or his idea of why we're motivated to do anything. If you look at the bottom of that triangle in the gold color, the physiological needs form the foundation of our survival. We have to breathe, we have to eat, we have to drink, we have to sleep, we have to do all those bodily functions that prove that we're alive and keep us alive. And as we move up that ladder of needs, we move next to the level of safety. In order for us to live at a higher level, and let's say for the purposes of this discussion, go to school and be successful, we have to feel safe. We have to feel secure. We have to believe that we have some protection from things that threaten us in our environment. And I'll get into that in a little bit. In the middle, we have relationships with other people, friendships, family, and so forth. We have a lot of kids who aren't motivated to do much, but they love to hang out with their kids, whether they're skateboarding or playing video games, because the sense of belonging is important. But why is it that kids belong to a group of other kids who are doing things that look like they're fun, but they're not hanging out with a bunch of kids who do things that don't feel like fun? That is, for example, schoolwork. We go up this pyramid a little bit. Look at the purple level. Esteem. One of the higher order needs that we have is to feel good about ourselves, to feel confident, to experience a sense of achievement and earn the respect of others. I'm going to make the case in this webinar that kids with bumps in their learning road, or their kids with problems or challenges like ADHD, have a hard time earning that sense of self-esteem in an academic environment. They might in other environments, but not in school, and we'll talk about why. At the highest level of Maslow's pyramid is what he calls self-actualization, the nirvana of existence. We've met all these previous needs, and therefore we can afford to think about things like morality and creativity and spontaneity and problem solving and all those kinds of things. Well, it makes sense then if we back down this pyramid, and if some of those earlier needs are not met, which I suggest in kids with ADHD they're not, it's hard for us to imagine having a full life. But when we can take away some of the barriers to what gets in the way of feeling good, feeling safe, we see kids rise to the occasion. We know out there we have this very bright, talented population of spontaneous, creative, and very funny kids. And when they shine, they really shine. And when they shut down, they really shut down hard. And I'd like to help us all turn that around a little bit. Why do humans do things? Maslow explained what our needs were, but why do we really do things at all? One is, as Maslow said, we want to survive. We want to sustain our life. At the basic level, we don't want to die. We want to be alive, and that's an important kind of things. We also work for the payoffs or the rewards. What's in it for me? If there's nothing in it for you, why do it? All of us in our own lives have situations like this. Sometimes we do things even though there aren't rewards because we have to for some other reason. Someone else is depending upon us or so forth. But it's really important to think about what the payoff is for kids when they do what we expect them or need them to do. There are rewards that are tangible, things like money or food or perks. How many of you as parents or even as teachers have bribed kids by offering them something, an extra star, some money, a prize, a toy? And it may work temporarily, but it doesn't work in the long term. We wonder why. The reward is great, but it's still not working. We also have intangible rewards to think about. These are the feelings that we get by doing things and feeling successful, feeling the thrill of the act, the joy in the completion of the act. These intangible rewards happen when we feel confident and competent, when we improve our status in our social group or in the eyes of our parents or our teachers. These are intangible rewards to doing a task and doing it well. We also, at this level, the intangible rewards on the negative side can be looked at this way. We tend not to do things because we want to avoid ridicule and shame. If we don't think we're going to be successful, it's likely we won't do something just to hide our incompetence. Let's look at why we don't do things. We have no interest in it. I don't want to do that, say kids. Why should I learn that? That's boring to me. It doesn't make any sense to me. I don't need to know that. And that not need to know goes along with this next item. The task needs the task meets no needs of ours, or we say, I don't need that. We may say to a kid, you should do this because you need to have this for your high school diploma or your college degree. And a kid can very easily say, I don't need that. And as soon as they say, I don't need it, it means their motivation to do things has decreased. As we talked about earlier, we don't do things because it offers no reward to us, or there's in our mind, it's not going to be worth the effort because nothing will happen as a result of it. And as I said earlier, doing nothing helps us to avoid ridicule or shame or failure. And we really have to look closely at that as we dig down into why kids with ADHD don't work as well as other kids. I'm going to reach up just for a minute and close my window because I have a neighbor who, unbeknownst to me, decided to mow his back 40. And so we're getting a little buzz in the background. I hope it's not too distracting, but we should be okay. Sorry for that distraction. Why don't we do things? We perceive that the task is dangerous or a threat to our safety. Remember Maslow's hierarchy? The very foundation of that hierarchy of needs suggests that if we feel threatened, we do not move up that ladder. We perceive that doing a task and failing at the task may make us look stupid. It may indicate that we are weak. Remember what Maslow said about status? It may suggest that we are incompetent. And as a result, it may make us feel like, or in reality, be a target or a victim. It doesn't mean you're a target of bullying or a victim of bullying. The next thing that happens if you fail in school is that typically your teacher will ask you either to do it again or do something else just like it. So the rewards aren't there. The challenge of the task is there, but you don't master it. And if you don't have a sense of mastery, you feel a sense of threat. Your survival mechanism activates, and that has a negative impact on thinking and motivation. Some kids say, if I don't do it, nobody really knows. So you see kids who are really passive or aggressively passive and they don't do anything at all. Well, that's a defensive move in many cases. They're trying to stay out of the limelight. If they don't do it at all, nobody knows whether you're smart or you're stupid. If you keep your mouth shut, the same thing is true. So these kids tend to sit in the back of a room, pull the hoodie up over their head, put their head down, put their earphones surreptitiously in their ears, listen to music, avoid all tasks. It's the same thing that an animal under threat does. It looks for a corner of the cave or the cage or a bush to hide under because they don't want to be found out. Their motivation is a little different here for kids than it is for animals, but the behavior is the same. So why do we have to look at neurobiology? Because simply stated, the brains of people with ADHD are different. We've been studying these kids and adults for 75 years, and we know a lot about the neurobiology of ADHD. We don't necessarily know how to fix it from a neurological perspective, but we understand that the brain processes information in a different way. And that's really an important piece of information to know, especially this. If you do a brain scan, a neuroimaging technique where you really look inside the brain as it's functioning, it shows that the very front part of the brain, right behind our forehead, the prefrontal cortex of kids with ADHD, is different in the way it processes information and the way it connects to other parts of the brain. That's really important because if the wiring of the brains of kids with ADHD is different from other kids, it doesn't mean they're not able to learn. It doesn't mean that they're not able to pay attention, but it certainly means that this is a challenge for them if they're living in a world where these tasks that require good brain integration are demanded of them every day. This means that it's more difficult for people with ADHD to do these kinds of things, to assess the complexity or difficulty level of a task. Well, if the front of the brain and the primitive survival center of the brain aren't talking back and forth to each other, and the thinking part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which developed later in our biological history, if that part of our brain is saying, here's something that you can't do, the primitive danger centers, the fear and the fight, flight, and fear centers of our brain, which are, I'm pointing in my head now, in the middle of our brain, are the in the old part of our brain, those parts of the brain are saying, well, if you can't do it, you better get away from it because it's dangerous. So here again, if you can't assess the difficulty level of a task, your go-to response in terms of your survival is to assume that it's too difficult. That's why a lot of these kids have this I can't attitude. They don't encounter a new task and say, okay, bring it on. I can do this. We want them to be able to do that, but there are neurobiological reasons why that's difficult. Again, and I say this to kids too, this is an explanation, not an excuse. I'll talk about the importance of having kids understand their own brain science in just a bit. So when kids have ADHD, it's difficult for them sometimes to make connections to prior learning. That is, if you and I do something, and let's say we're efficient learners, we learn to golf or knit or play a musical instrument, and then somebody says, can you play this game? Can you make this sweater? Can you play this song? You will say to yourself somewhere in your brain, I have done this before. I have been successful. And therefore, the bridge to this new activity is not very wide. A lot of kids with ADHD who don't have a big success history look at a new task as if every task is new. So we're on high alert. We're on high alert for danger as human beings, as organisms. And if the task is perceived as new and not like something we did before, that means we're likely to have a just a minute response, a let's be careful response, a stressful response to a new task. And that's important too. So if you have ADHD because of your brain differences, it's difficult to organize a plan of action. It's difficult to see what comes next and project into the future about how long that task is going to take. It's also difficult to execute a response, especially if you are in a state of fear or anxiety or worry about the task, because your fear centers are taking over and your higher level cognitive centers are shutting down in the service of fear. So that's why it's hard to get going, to kick into gear in the first place. It's difficult to, and when you finish that task, you're so happy to have it done sometimes. Somebody says to you, how do you think you did? And the kid's answer is, I don't know, let's just get away from this. I did what I had to do and I'm out of here. And then if the next thing we have looks just like it, we start this cycle over and over and over again. It's difficult for a lot of kids to store the experience of success, to store what they have learned in their long-term memory so it can be pulled up later or retrieved later in order to use as the building block for new learning that comes their way. So just go back and look at this list for a minute. If you have ADHD and you have 2 or 3 or 5 of these characteristics, learning is going to be more difficult for you. Learning is exhibiting behavior that is related to motivation. It's all tied in together. And if you have this condition, it doesn't mean you can't do it. There are many, many people, young and old, with ADHD who are motivated, who are successful, and who continue to be successful despite some of these neurobiological challenges. And that's the good news. And the same thing is true for a lot of the kids that you and I worry about. There is potential. There is hope. Kids who lack confidence or who don't feel competent develop this I can't mindset. And when you say I can't do something, that increases the fear factor, the primitive protective part of the brain that keeps us safe from things goes into high gear. Look at the small print here. When the primitive fight or flight areas of the brain are activated, these are the parts of the brain that allow us to regulate our heart rate, to run when we see danger, to regulate our blood pressure, to keep us breathing in a way that supports our body. It makes us not hungry because we don't have time to eat food, so it turns the energy in our body into energy that we use to run and get away from situations. When the primitive fight or flight areas of the brain are activated, the prefrontal cortex, which, as I've said, is necessary for planning and execution of tasks, actually shuts down in the service of survival. So the conundrum here is, the difficulty is that the part of our brain in the front of our heads that we need for organizing and planning, and indeed to increase our motivation, when that part of our brain is deactivated, we become very inefficient learners. Our fear factor goes up, our cognitive abilities go down, our desire to escape a situation increase. This is why some of us, when we get into highly stressful situations, say, I can't think straight, and that's exactly what's happening. There's so much going on. Your life is so filled with stress or worries or activities. And somebody says to you, what time is my appointment next week? And you say, I don't know. I have to look at my book. I have no idea what to tell you about that. I can't think straight means that something else is going on in the brain. And my contention is that that's going on a lot in the brains of kids with ADHD. The other thing that happens in this population of kids, and when I say kids, I mean school-age kids, college-age kids, and sometimes I mean adults, because a lot of the times the problems that little kids have grow up and become adult kind of problems. Adults, luckily, tend to find jobs or activities in which they're more intrinsically motivated and therefore have less difficulty with motivation, but it's not always true. In school, you don't have a lot of choices. You have to do history. You have to do math. You have to do writing unless you're homeschooled or in some kind of creative curriculum. So you always have to be ready to face that new challenge. But when you don't have success, this stuff builds up and it develops what I've come to call it cumulative toxicity. So you have failure after failure or failure, or even not necessarily failure, but lack of success. If someone put you into a sport like tennis and you could never hit the ball, I would ask you, how long would you play? And if somebody said to you, hey, let's go out on the court and knock a few balls around, where do you want to be? Not on the court. You're not going to look good. You're not going to feel good. You won't feel successful, and you may feel like a failure. Nobody wants that. So we have to turn this around. How much bad news can a person take? How much failure can a person take? Failure affects both the neurochemistry of the brain. That is, if you experience fear and your brain is spending a lot of time to protect you from the danger or the risk, and in this case, again, I'm talking about the risk of not performing well academically, or the risk of making a public mistake in front of someone else, or the risk of doing something impulsively and then not doing it right. Every time that happens, the brain learns from that. The brain is very good about learning from bad experiences. And I'll talk about a ratio in just a minute. But the brain resets itself like a thermometer in a house. How much of this can we take? So when we talk about lack of motivation and we see kids shutting down, part of that is the neurobiology of the brain doing what it needs to do to protect itself. Cover up your head, put your head down. Don't do this. Don't engage. This has happened before. It'll happen again. Stay away from this. So you look at motivation from that perspective. So many of the things that we try to do to get kids to do more work don't work because there's no acknowledgement about what's going on inside. So failure affects neurochemistry, and it affects attitude. Some people think, well, being not motivated is just an attitudinal thing. If we could change the kid's attitude about school or the task, that would help. But attitudes are the consequences of previous experiences with things, or a perception of what it would be like if you tried that thing and failed. Increase that tension or stress with the reality that you had a bad history of things not going well for you. You develop the attitude that we see at home and in school. But the attitude is based in neurochemistry. It's not as simple as changing attitude. You're not going to punish this attitude out of kids. You might not be able to reward this attitude out of kids. So what do we do about that? Well, stay tuned. In a little bit, we'll talk about that. But first, let's look at success. What does success do for us? Well, the brain loves success. It's addictive. Think about video games that kids play. Kids with ADHD who have difficulty in school or don't seem motivated to do anything, and they're plugged into games, either single-player games or group games, for hours and hours and hours. Why would they do that and not do that with reading? Well, one of the reasons we say that games are addictive, they're addictive if you play a game that puts you at a level where you experience success more than failure. I guarantee if you put a kid in front of a video game, no matter how exciting and how colorful and how energized it is, that doesn't allow the kid to get some good positive hits early on and then move the kid toward the next highest level, the kid would walk away from that game too. Video games are designed to give kids early exposure to success at lower levels of performance, and then based on that performance, increase the difficulty difficulty level of the task. Not only does the game increase the difficulty level of the task automatically, if you're a player, you ask the game to give you something more difficult to do. How often does that happen in school? With these kids, not very often at all. So what's my suggestion to you? Become like video games? That's impossible. But if you think about having kids experience a level of success when they enter into a new activity, increases the likelihood that they will want to move forward. And the more that happens, the more the brain feels good. Let me share with you just a quick piece of research. Kids with ADHD don't get enough of that experience, and that's a problem. That's why they get pulled away from other kinds of things that aren't related to school or activities that we need them to do. I read some research a while back that did brain scans of athletes, Olympic level athletes, runners, and they wired their brains and they showed them videos. When I say they wired their brains, they put a scanning apparatus. They don't wire anything, but the apparatus, it's an external thing. Anyway, show these athletes pictures of themselves being successful. And when they do that, the pleasure centers of their brain light up. The centers of the midbrain, the primitive brain that are the feel-good centers that are related to emotions and feelings, those areas of the brain light up. Light up means that they're activated. Success activates the successful experiences activate the success centers of the brain. If you then show those same athletes a picture of them tripping over a hurdle and falling down, the fear centers of their brain activate. The prefrontal cortex deactivates. They're looking for literally the exit sign to get out of the situation. So that's not surprising. What is surprising, in order to get the brain to light up in the success-oriented way, you have to show videos of them being successful 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, until the fear centers, the avoidance centers, the motivation centers of their brains shut down and the lights get dimmer and the prefrontal cortex activates again. And they go from an I can't and oh my God, isn't that embarrassing state of mind to a I can do this. I'm back on track again. So if we have physiological evidence that success lights up different parts of the brain and failure lights up other parts of the brain, and it takes 3 successful experiences to wipe out the failure response, think about what that means in terms of the learning the kids are exposed to. You really have to think about a hierarchy of difficulty, and I'll talk about some easy strategies to help you do that in just a minute. So to stop here at this point, to summarize, a lack of motivation or intermittent motivation or selective motivation in kids and adolescents with ADHD is generally related to these things, which we've talked about: the neurobiologically imposed challenge, the brain not working in the same way, kids who have difficulty engaging in a task, staying focused, seeing it through to completion. Also, the person's perception of difficulty and their perception of their ability. Let me stop there for a minute. What the person thinks about the difficulty level of the task is more important than anything any parent or teacher says. We say, I know you can do this. It's easy. You've done this before. Those words fall on deaf ears of a kid who's really trying to experience success, but find it very difficult. So the perception of the difficulty level is really important, and the perception of one's ability level to do that is important too. Difficulty and ability, and I'll show you a simple technique to get around that in just a minute. The difficulties with motivation and attention are also related to a history of success or failure, and I've talked about that before. But what I hadn't said before is what's in the last part of this sentence: a history of success or failure on this or a related task. So when kids have done something like this, they say, well, this task smells like that one. I wasn't successful there, so this isn't going to work for me. So that might be as generalized as math. And you hear some kids say, I don't do math. I can't do math. I'm lousy at math. I won't do math. It could be reading, could be writing, could be memorizing things. A lot of things get in the way, but the history affects current performance. Also, the perception of necessity. Some kids do things because they say, I have to do this, or they say things like, I can't get my driver's license and do this unless I do these kinds of things. So there's some very high reward things that happen in the lives of kids that get them past this point, but they don't sustain them. Once they get what they need, they shut back down. They go back into their default setting. The likelihood of a quick hit or high reward, like what I've come to call hit and run, that means you get the hit and you run away. Now, these kids don't get the hit and look for another one necessarily. It's not like playing a slot machine, but it's go for the prize. Once you get it, walk away, and I'll talk about why. You want to avoid dangerous situations. This all leads to a self-defeating cycle. I can't do this, so I won't do this. And therefore, I can't do this. And it goes on and on and on. And when you encourage kids or when you force them to do something, you say, you have to do this. Your homework is due tomorrow. You only have an hour left. This needs to get done. You hear things from them like, see, I did it. I can't do it. I told you. You don't listen to me. And then you get into these arguments that in some families can go on for hours at night. And if you think about those arguments as a survival technique, this is a little hard, a little bit of a reach, but it's true. Kids get engaged with you in fighting and arguing about things because they don't want you to be witnessing them being less than competent. These are your kids. They love you. You love them. And if every time they do something, they look not smart, not talented, not competent, that hurts. That's hard to take. If a kid tries something and gets it right, she's likely to do two things. One, undervalue her sense of control or agency, to say things like, okay, I did it. I did it okay. I got lucky. And if you feel lucky when you're successful, that's not really successful. Or the child is likely to say, something like, that was baby stuff. She discounts the task. She got it right, but she got it right because it was so easy. Anybody would get it right. Those aren't ways to build self-concept. Those aren't reactions that increase your motivation. Those are just temporary placeholders and don't stand in. Don't take the place of motivation. So several practical strategies that I've used and that I've suggested to lots of teachers to use to break the cycle of failure and stress and low motivation and get kids tuned in and turned on. These are fairly simple techniques. And I'm not saying they're a cure-all, but they get at the roots of some of the things that I've been talking about that explain why kids have such difficulty with motivation. Number one is, I think it's important to teach kids about the neuroscience of stress and how it affects their motivation as kids with ADHD. I've seen kids as young as late middle school do a science lesson on how the brain works and what happens to motivation and behavioral function in animals and people when the organism is stressed. It's a neat lesson for kids to do if they're getting prepared for, let's say, a science fair, or it's a neat lesson for a 5th or 6th or 7th or 12th grade class to do, to study about the impact of stress and how you approach a task, how that's related to motivation and what's going on in your brain. Because as soon as kids understand that it's something else inside them and not their attitude that's getting in their way, they tend to have more of a better sense of understanding and more of a sense of control over the situation. So lessons that teach about the neuroscience of stress, those are important. Even if it's a short YouTube video, enough to get them thinking away from them as failed human beings to them as people who have brains that may be different, but can still be very effective if you learn how to master the stress and anxiety that shut down motivation and increase fear. So one really practical way to do this is use what I call success rating scales. And you see in the small print there, 1 to 5, show me the hand. That means almost everybody has 1 or 2 hands. And if you raise your thumb up in the thumbs up sign, usually that means in most cultures, great, you did a good job. 5 straight up, 5 fingers up, facing you, sticking in your face means there's no way I can do this. So 5 is intense resistance. So again, 1 is thumbs up, and I can do this. 5 is no way I can do this. And you can use that same simple scale, even with very little kids, to help them understand how difficult they perceive the task to be. So a teacher or a parent pulls out the task that the child is going to be expected to work on. And the first thing a teacher or a parent says is, how difficult do you think this is? So if a kid raises up his or her hand with 5 fingers facing you, that suggests that she thinks that is really wicked difficult, as we say up here in New England. So that's a really, really difficult task. Well, it doesn't stop there. Some kids move on. Some Navy SEALs, for example, when you show them a task, they will almost always say, that's a really difficult task. So the next question is, how much ability do you have to handle that? So if somebody says 5, that's really a difficult task, but 1, I have a lot of ability to handle that. That's a good combination. And what we look for in kids who are successful and who are motivated is an accurate perception of difficulty. That is, that they rate a task as difficult as it really is for them. And the best way to find that out and show them that is you keep a file of their work from the past, work that was like this. And if they say, whoa, I think that math problem is a 5 task, very, very difficult, you as a teacher or a parent can pull out of a homework file a task that's similar on which the child agreed with you that he or she did pretty well. Now that takes some of the fear factor out of this. This reduces the stress of the perception of difficulty that scares a lot of kids away. The other way you use this 5-point rating scale is to have kids rate their ability level, as I said. Ideally, we're looking for optimal learning, a 3-3 combination. 3 level of difficulty means it's kind of hard, but I've done things like this before and I can handle it. And 3 perception of ability is, well, I probably have enough ability. 3-3 is kind of a work zone kind of thing. If you look at 5 level of difficulty and 5 level of unwillingness, that's a no-go. That's a situation that the child's not going to be motivated in. I'm not trying to suggest that it's always about the difficulty level of the task. Motivation is complex. As I said, it's learned over time. But when motivation is low, it often means that the brain is perceiving something to be too difficult or not worthwhile enough. So the other scale you could add to this is a worthwhile scale. How important is this to you? And if a kid says 5, I could care less about this. That's a perception you might want to work on, because unless you get that perception down to a level 3, that might be something I want to work on, that child's going to be fighting it because he or she's going to say it's just not worth it. One way to do that is to create a learning activity that helps a child achieve or demonstrate the stated goals of the activity, but do it on a more personal level. So, for example, if you have a kid who's involved in video games, I'm going to use the example again, who's addicted to video games, how do you teach any concept using the context of a video game to do it? Can a kid write about it? Can a kid look into the math that's behind the gaming strategy? It might be not games, it might be music. If a kid loves certain kinds of musicians, can you get a child to write a story about the musician and not about the topic that the textbook calls for? If the child is resistant to writing or has difficulty with writing because of an associated learning disability, can you have the child then talk about the concept and the content? So we have to increase motivation by increasing interest, but we're not going to increase in interest in a task by beating a kid over the head with it. All right, let's move on. We just got a little more to do before we have some time for Q&As. For me, it's been important to teach teachers and parents how to help kids analyze their asset profile. In other words, to say to a child when confronted with a task that he or she doesn't seem very motivated in, to say, well, before we even ask you to do it, what do you have going for you? What skills do you have that might make it possible for you to do this task well? And if the kid says, I have nothing, I'm a failure, I'm a loser, which we often hear, then as teachers and parents, we can say, well, I know that you stuck with that guitar piece for 2 hours. So when you say you don't have any stick-to-itiveness or persistence, let me suggest to you that in some situations you do. And this calls for a little bit of that trait. Are you able or willing to do that? And you really have to have this discussion repeatedly with kids, but not beat them over the head with it. The other thing that's important is to have the kid with you, if necessary, analyze the barriers to success. Here's the task. What's going to get in the way of you doing it? And the kid may say, well, I can't do that homework because I have a little baby brother and he's crying, or my dog tears up the homework, or my parents are fighting, or whatever it might be. So you have the child analyze both his or her assets, and then we have to figure out ways to increase the asset profile. And then you have kids analyze the barriers. What do you think will get in the way? And then we ask, is there anything that you can do to decrease those barriers? Can you go to a quiet place in your house? Can you work in the library after school? And you may need to suggest to kids ways to get around those language barriers, as well as how to build those asset profiles. So it's important to teach kids strategies to maximize the former, that is the assets, and minimize the latter. And the very best way to do that is by examples and keeping a folder of previous work that you can pull out so you can say at a time of low motivation, this one is like that one. You did that well. You didn't love it, but you did it well, and you did it, and you felt good about it. The other technique that I want to suggest, and I'll give you a link to an article about this, is something called setting a competence anchor. And I've hinted at it just in a few minutes ago. You keep a work file of things that the child did well. You use that rating scale and you put these numbers on the actual activity, on the physical evidence of the activity. So you pull out a difficult task in writing, for example, and you look in the upper right-hand corner, and the child has said at the beginning of the task, wow, this is a 5, way too hard. What's your ability level? 1, very low. And then at the end of the task in the bottom right-hand corner, the kid modifies the rating scale and says, well, you know what? It wasn't a 5, it was a 3. And I didn't have no ability to do this, if you forgive the grammar. Maybe a 3. So it turns a 5-1 turns into a 3-3. You pull this out and you suggest to the kid that the activity that's on the table before her is just like this activity. You might stand a greater chance of this child initiating the activity, staying with it, and working toward completion because there's a track record of success. The brain wants to be successful. Here's an explanation of that. And again, I'll give you a link about how to get a kid back to a place of success and competence and try to start out from there. So here's some resources for you. A general article about stress in kids is one that I happen to write for Attitude Magazine, and you can link to that in the first reference. There's another article that I wrote about setting a competence anchor. A general article about executive functioning for ADHD, for Attitude Magazine again. An article about using the rating scales is there for you. And another Attitude Magazine article by the illustrious Dr. Thomas Brown talking about motivation in ways that support and supplement some of the things that I've talked to you about today. I think that these will be placed on your resource guide. You get a slideshow of this presentation when you're done, so you'll have these resources available to you. I hope they're helpful. One of the resources that I would like to suggest in the beginning, in the introduction, my host was gracious enough to mention a book that I had written called Nowhere to Hide. A lot of these concepts are available in that book. The book is available from Amazon, but as I point out below, you might also get actual physical help from a human in a bookstore near you. So if they still exist, try those out. So now that brings us to close to the close of my formal part of the presentation and to the next exciting feature about the opportunity for me to have the opportunity to answer questions from all of you fine people around the globe. So I'll stop and wait for my host to take over.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jerome. I'm over here just scrawling notes like a mad person. And I know that our listeners have also gotten a lot of insight and new understanding. I wanted to read you one specific. I'm finally beginning to understand why my ADHD husband and 2 kids are reluctant to even understand and learn about ADHD and how it pertains to them. Thank you for this breakthrough for me. So
let's
a lot of breakthroughs. So I'm going to start right in on, we had a number of questions regarding the pandemic and sort of the very unique scenario we find ourselves in where our children have lost confidence and in part with that, because they've lost skills over the last year and a half, they've been stuck at home. And so that what number of people are reporting is a great deal of anger, that they realize their kids need to catch up on reading and writing in particular. And when they sit down to try some of these strategies, they literally get books thrown at them. It's that anger impulse, I guess, that would be part of that fight or flight you talked about. But do you have any advice for these parents just to get their kids to calm down enough to hear them out and to make that first step?
Yeah, and it's important to talk about the pandemic, kind of the elephant in the room, which I didn't talk about. But I kind of liken that situation to going to a gym. I go to a gym and I couldn't go during pandemic. So some of my muscles atrophied. And now I have to go back in and start all over again and build up my body to the point where it can be successful. And how do I feel about that? I feel angry. I feel angry at the pandemic. I feel angry that I couldn't get the exercise videos on screen to work. I felt like I was doing homeschooling and it wasn't working. I didn't have the equipment I needed. And I know that I was falling farther and farther behind because every time I tried to lift a box or a suitcase, I couldn't do it. Oh, kids at home are the same way, especially little kids who are in the beginning stages of the developmental level of learning to do math or writing. These are hierarchical skills that if you don't learn the foundational skills, you slip backwards. If you don't practice those skills, you slip backwards. So you have some kids, especially those with ADHD, who are sitting or not sitting in front of a screen during virtual instruction and falling farther and farther and farther behind. So I think maybe we're seeing a little bit of light in this dark tunnel. It might be important for kids to acknowledge the anger. It is important. It's not that it might be, but it's important to acknowledge the anger, but also think about the source of the anger. You have worked so hard, honey, to learn these skills that you were doing pretty well at the end of last year. And now you feel like you're losing confidence, you're losing face, you're losing status. Let's go back and think in terms of setting a competence anchor. Let's go back at the level at which you were when you were doing really pretty well. And the kid may say, well, that's stupid. That's baby work. I'm in 5th grade now. You're going to take me back to 3rd grade? And the answer is, yeah, we are. Because if you don't golf for a year and then somebody asks you to go out and play a game of golf, they're not going to start you out on a full course with a full bag of clubs. They're going to take you out to the driving range and they're going to build up your confidence again. And the same thing is true for swimming or any other skill that you have or piano playing. And so I think it's important to acknowledge kids that, yeah, we've all lost something. Many of us have taken a step backwards, but we have an obligation to ourselves to get back on that train and step up. So if a kid is just getting angry and throwing books, to acknowledge anger is one thing. To say, you can feel angry, but it's not okay to throw a book at me. So I'm going to leave the room. You are going to end up doing this because it's a requirement of most state laws that you learn these things. But it would be much easier for me to help you if we're not caught up in all this anger. If you can get the kid to say, yeah, it would be a lot easier for me too. That would be a goal there. But I think it's important to understand the source of the anger. Build up confidence, get kids moving, and do it in a really fun way. And don't stick them in front of a screen or an automated learning program to do that. Sit down with them, take turns reading the book. So it's more of a fun time together if you can have the luxury of doing that. But try to make it more fun. If the book assigned by the school is not motivating to the child, have the child pick something out of his or her own personal library, go to the library, go online, even watch a video of the story, get the kid back into the content, and then maybe the subject matter will follow. I could talk on this for days, but I know we have other questions, so I'm going to stop.
Well, the next one is related, and that is a number of people inquiring about how to get the teachers on board. So here's one specific. They said that their son is working 2 to 3 times as long as his classmates. The teachers don't see this. And they said, how can we get his teachers to see his struggles and adjust how they teach him? He's chronically anxious, stressed, and tired from learning and homework, and it's incredibly challenging for him. Other listeners as well inquiring about how they understand that teachers have been facing a world of obstacles as well, and they're looking for some ideas of how to get the teachers on board and working as a team with them.
Yeah, I think it's a common question. And I think one of the things you said is really important, that the teachers don't know that. So teachers have to know that. And so the expedient way to let teachers know is for you as a parent to say to the teachers, are you aware that my Billy is spending 2.5 hours on an assignment, which used to take him a half an hour, or we don't know how long it's supposed to take him. He doesn't know. He's not the kind of kid who's going to pick up the phone and call a friend and say, I've been at this for an hour and a half. How long have you been at it? That's not going to happen. I often suggest to teachers in my work in teacher training or school consultation to ask the kids to go home. Tell them they have a homework assignment. If it's virtual, do the same thing. You have an assignment in front of you. The teacher says, it is my expectation that you will not work on this any more than 1/2 hour. And when you finish that half hour, I want you to show your parents, if they're around, make a mark there. And next time we get back together, I want to privately find out how far each of you got. I'll have you text me or send me a message of some kind. If 3/4 of you got through the whole thing in half an hour, I know it's pretty right on target. But if 1/4 of you didn't get even halfway through, I know that you and I have to do a little more work. Either I have to adjust the assignment, or we have to find out what's taking you so long to do something that I thought would be a lot faster. So you really have to have this level of communication. Otherwise, this kid is swamped in assignment after assignment after assignment and never able to get out of it. So sensitive teachers want to know this information. Good teachers respond by saying, we can do something about that. I want you on track 75% of the time. I don't want you to get experience stress and frustration at 1/4 of the way through and then never want to do it again. That's not what school's supposed to be about. So how you get teachers on board, I would respectfully, as a former teacher, if a parent called me and said, here's my situation, I want to know if you're aware of it. No, I'm sorry, I didn't know that. And if you are, what would your suggestion be? And if the teacher said, I have no clue, I've got so many kids like this, it's so frustrating and so stressful, I would help the teacher find counseling. But I would go say, if it's a common matter, maybe I can encourage you to talk among your colleagues or your administrators about it and address this issue head on, because I and a lot of parents like me have a lot of concerns about this. So we're counting on you to help us out with this, because we're parents, we're not teachers, although we've been doing a pretty good job this past year. It's your turn. What can you do for us?
We've all been doing our best. Oh my goodness. We have some interesting questions regarding the relationship between perfectionism and this fear of failure and ADHD. Some parents feeling that their kids' resistance or perhaps lack of motivation actually comes from perfectionist tendencies.
Yeah. That's quite possible. I've done a lot of work with kids who are referred to as twice exceptional, kids who might have ADHD and gifted and talentedness. And the issue of motivation among that population is really a challenge, because these are kids, you know, if I talked about the general kid who is not a perfectionist, but who won't engage in a task because of his or her perception of the difficulty level, or in this case, the child's perception of what this thing will look like when I'm finished. If I'm a perfectionist, and I don't mean to use that word necessarily in a bad way, if I like to do things really well, and I know that if I start it, it may not look good. So if Picasso's a bad example because he could paint whatever he wanted, but if somebody like Michelangelo would stand back and say, I'm not going to start this painting because it's going to look crappy, we would have no art in the world. It would be terrible. So I think it's a matter of saying to these kids, what's your expectation? What would a finished product look like for you? When you close your eyes and imagine this task completed, what would the characteristics be? And then pick one or two of those characteristics and say, let's knock those off. Let's see if we can make one of those things happen, two of those things happen. Let's start out slowly. Perfectionism freezes you in place, because if you're a perfectionist and you don't believe that you can be perfect, why do it? You know, we go back to the motivation, Maslow's motivations again. So it's not a complete answer, but I think it's important to understand why perfectionism forms a barrier to motivation, and then try to look at the child's expectations and get the child to at least break the task apart a little bit, or temper the expectations, at least for the first time.
Very, very good advice. Yes. Yeah. We did have a number of questions regarding students who are twice exceptional, and that it doesn't seem to be a failure perhaps, but it could be exactly what you were talking about, failure in their vision of what success should look like, which is perhaps more ambitious than other kids' vision of success. So another sort of related question that I just thought was so interesting: could the fear of failure and disappointment, making the children say no to so many things, could that be confused with oppositional defiant disorder?
Well, you bet it can. Yeah. I think oppositional defiant disorder is probably one of the most overdiagnosed conditions because of that factor. Kids exhibit this aggressive resistance or negativity to everything. And unless you consider this as a possible factor, kids might end up with a diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder, which means they're oppositional and they're defiant. And that sounds like negative behavior. If you look at a child's work history, and look at her success ratio in terms of failure, or you look at her feeling of how much in her life she has control over, all those things are really important. Oppositional behavior, defiant behavior, that all serves a purpose. That's just not, I've never met a kid with that diagnosis who's been an evil kid. And I think that's an important thing to remember. Every behavior serves somebody's needs. So to be oppositional and defiant means you don't know how bad I am, or you don't know how imperfect I am. So yeah, and if the intervention for both is different, an oppositional defiant kid, it's almost like the blame is on the kid. But if a kid has an underlying fear of failure that's giving rise to oppositional or defiant behavior, that's a totally different picture. You see people on the golf course again who take a shot and then take their golf club and bend a 300, I don't know how much they cost, over their knee and bend a golf club. I mean, is that oppositional defiant disorder? What does that mean? If every golfer who did that got that diagnosis, the golf courses would shut down.
Sorry about that. I lost my lost my microphone for a second. No, I was reading through. We have so many comments, and I'm a lot of people really getting a lot of insight here today. So more questions than we could possibly answer. And it is right at 2:00. So we are going to have to wrap up today's webinar. But Jerome, thank you so much. This was really illuminating. And I think we all benefited greatly from your insight and these very practical strategies as we head into what we hope will be a much more normal school year, knock on wood, and all other things. I just want to quickly encourage our listeners to keep an eye out for future Attitude webinars. We do these every week, and they are always free. Thank you again, Jerome, for leading this webinar today, and thank you everyone for joining us. We hope to see you again soon.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.